Okay, I think we could get started and realizing that people will make their way in, but since we are short of time, I think we'll try to get started. So first of all, a hearty welcome to everybody who is here, both our panelists and people who are attending. Just so you know, if you haven't been to a HM panel yet, there is a Q&A option where you can write in questions and all that. So, and there is someone, Liana, who's working with us to facilitate the meeting. And so this panel, just so everybody is clear, is exploring the possibilities and complications of developing new global organizations to confront global capitalism. And of course, well, one way to look at it, it's been nearly 200 years since Chartists in the UK began writing and actually speaking publicly about the need for labor to organize internationally in the face of capitalism that even at that time was increasingly operating and organizing, certainly internationally and to degrees globally. So we could say the lutte continue, if I may be so bold. So I'm, by the way, Robert Latham, and I'll serve as the animator, sort of chair of the panel, and I teach in the Department of Politics at York University. And I first really want to make sure that we recognize that we owe a great deal of thanks to Monsieur Yves Rochon, who has put together this panel and organized it. And so I really want to extend that very heartily. And I asked him when I agreed to take on this role, was what motivated him to sort of organize a panel. And so he conveyed, in a sense, if I can speak for him a little bit, but I think I capturing some of the, just a couple of points, he kind of made a point that it's never acceptable to just let it be, that the left and more generally workers and the oppressed would continue to be far less organized than the forces of capitalism, right? I mean, I think Yves really wanted to make sure that we could try to bring into dialogue perspectives regarding both workers and capitalists. And I think finally, we hope that the challenges of anti-capitalist organizing would be thought of, especially with regard to changes in class composition and how we might address some of those issues. So I hope everyone's read the panel abstract on the schedule, and I won't be doing that, but just there are a couple of issues panelists I think will be addressing, and that is that kind of just extracting from that, just first, like what kind of organization should and can be built, who can initiate it, whether it be trade union related or not, in what ways can capitalist organization from transnational corps to the IMF be challenged and even undermined? And finally, should there and can there be global level coordination of left action and movements at local, regional, international levels? And it's a question that's kind of dear to my heart as someone who's been thinking through possibilities of socialist internationalism. So the order of the presentations will follow the list that we have on the panel description. And I'll just quickly introduce everybody. First, Micah who go first. And we have Micah Sonzuji, who teaches at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. And she's author of, and I've translated this, Losing the South, Decolonizing International Solidarity, I think. Yeah, and so interesting play. And just the second part, both are quite interesting subtitles, the subtitle and the regular title. And she's involved in a number of organizations, such as the Task Force for Anti-Racism, Accountability for Canadian International Cooperation Sector. William Robertson has been an activist in Latin America, and he teaches sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he's done a great deal of important work on global capitalism and the formation of the new transnational capitalist class in books such as some of you will be aware of the theory of global capitalism, for example. We have also Catherine Nastovsky, who teaches at work in labor studies in the Department of Social Science at York. Hi, fellow Yorkie. And she spent years as a union activist an international labor solidarity organizer, and this informs her study of global labor. And I think we look forward to a book that's not too far down the road from her that's titled or tentatively titled Transnational Horizons, Workers in Canada Enter the Global Sphere. And certainly, last but certainly not least, Torkil Leisen is a longtime anti-imperialist activist, and he's a writer living in Denmark. And in Denmark, he's a member of the International Forum. And his extensive writing relating to issues that are taken up in his activism historically has been published not just in Danish, but also in English, and such as the book Global Perspective, Reflections on Imperialism and Resistance. So we'll turn the floor over to Micah at this point. And just so you know, we're aiming for 8 minutes for each presentation. So we leave time for Q&A and all sorts of discussion. So Micah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. I also want to acknowledge that I personally in the organizing committee are based in indigenous land who are unceded, Mohawk for myself, but then a bunch of others in Quebec. And I also want to thank Yves Rochon, who's the organizer, the mind behind this panel. And I was delighted when he contacted me because honestly, one of my criticism of left-wing movements in general, especially recently more around degrowth and deglobalization, are very much focused on the national level or the local level. And honestly, we're just too busy working on conditions of workers and conditions of people close to us that we forget to think about the international. And for me, having not an interest, but seeing international solidarity, transnational solidarity, struggles, fights, inequalities, oppression, exploitation is crucial to our transition out of capitalism. It's not just the global inequalities or what I call the institutionalized global order is not an effect of capitalism, is in colonialism, especially in colonization, have been have formed what capitalism is today. And so we need to think about it if we want to transition. And so simultaneously at the multilateral level, the transnational level, the international level, which are interrelated. And so the starting point of my book, which in French is called Perdre le Sud, Décoloniser la solidarité internationale. The start of it was about the fact that the international level, which for a lot of people is just out of their scope, is part of our lives. So Saskia Sassen and many others have done sociology of globalization, how globalization is actually in the local level. And so we need to consider and think about how we're going to organize at the multilateral level in order to make our local fights and struggles successful. And so what I try to think about in terms of this panel is not only exploitation or multinationals or capital and capitalism, but also what I call the institutionalized world order, based on Nancy Fraser institutionalized social order, how she defines capitalism as not only economical, but also linked to patriarchy and coloniality. And well, she doesn't really talk about, so she talks about patriarchy and racism and other forms of social orders, which together form what she calls capitalism. And I thought that there was missing this international level where, especially linked with colonialism, so modern versions of colonization, which includes like an order based on racialization of social relations and systemic racism and what researchers in the global south in Latin America have called the coloniality of power, colonialidad de poder. And so I think when we think about multilateral organizations and institutions, we need to think about how they will simultaneously fight not only sectoral struggles, but also how they will affect this institutionalized world order. So what it is, in short, is it does not start with globalization. And a lot of criticism of globalization start at a point in time where maybe even as far as the Industrial Revolution or an increase in economical relations and direct investments and stuff like that. But I think we need to go back to colonization and understand how, and I've worked with Carrie Polanyi, who's the daughter of Carl Polanyi, and she was working on a book that's probably going to go out about how capitalism was in fact started with colonization, and now global inequalities started with colonialism, which is also linked to systemic racism, and how before colonization we used to consider ourselves as brothers and sisters, and kings in Europe would interact with kings in Africa as brothers and sisters, and Lahore or Agra in India were cities much more developed and industrialized and beautiful, much more beautiful than cities like London. And so this enabled the accumulation of wealth and capital in the hands of Europeans, which later enabled a development of capitalism in a much more productive, successful way. And so colonization, I won't go into a history of colonization who became colonialism, which are modern day relations of coloniality, which is also in our subjectivity, which I think in Marxist circles, we need to talk much more about systemic racism and the fact that not everyone is exploited the same. And there's both in terms of gender and in terms of social race. And bref, this social order is also linked to patriarchy because, as you know, there's not only an international division of labor, there's also a sexual international division of labor, which ends up, women end up in the less secure and less paid jobs in the international level. And so we have to, in our thinking of building organizations, we need to think about post-capitalism in gendered and anti-decolonial ways. And when I say coloniality of power, it's specifically that we, and that's what coloniality of power is about, is the fact that we dehumanize certain bodies. And in economic exploitation, this is really salient in terms of especially women of the global south who have conditions that strip them from their basic human rights, and especially racialized populations. Today, it's not, if we think about China, the monthly salary is about $300, but in Ethiopia, the monthly salary is about $38. So we need to think about why we enable this, and why the institutionalized world order not only permits this, but encourages it. Not only economic exploitation, but a type of exploitation, a racialized capitalism. And so I like the abstract of our panel, which I've not read in the details before I prepared for this presentation. And it is important to think about trade unions and how we should regulate companies and transnational mechanisms to share, for example, info about various resistance in the world, and how we should coordinate left-wing movements. But what I think is missing in a lot of the left-wing talks about international organization, and then again, I'm delighted to be in a panel where we think about those issues, because in most movements we just don't, which for me doesn't make sense, but still, I mean, I'm very glad. But we often forget about, okay, so what are we gonna do about refugees? What are we gonna do about indigenous rights to land, or claims to get back their lands, and environmental relations, or pharmaceutical companies, and I forget the word in English, but le système de brevet, the TRIPS at the WTO, for vaccines, the systems that enables the companies to make profit for decades. These kinds of agreements, which are made at the international level, but have very concrete, bodily, embodied consequences. But we need to deal with those issues at the international level, but they're not related to labor or work. And so we need to also address that. What about global health? What about the WHO? Like, we also need to think about those organizations. What do we do about colonialism and colonization in Palestine? What do we do about cultural genocide in Tibet? And so what kind of organizations are going to do this? And we need to think about, are we going to get involved in other countries? Oh, I'm going over time, aren't I? Okay, anyway, so I was concluding anyway, so yeah, are we going to respect the sacrosanct sovereignty, stuff like that? So anyways, we need to think about the institutionalized world order. Thanks. I wasn't looking at you at all for time, but I asked you to tell me, but.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's just worked out, don't worry. So William, please, is going to speak. You're yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. I was going to say, I'm saying we're we're all in these different time zones. So I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everyone out there. And I want to also, before I start, a shout out, thank you to Yves Chauchon. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but he contacted me over a year ago when originally this was going to be an in-person conference, and we've been in touch ever since. And I really want to thank him. And I assume he's out there in the audience. We can't see you guys in the audience. So it's now commonplace to say that capital has gone global and therefore resistance has to be global. And I couldn't agree more. But I want to add on to that, that for me, we're in a new historical epoch of world capitalism, the globalization or global capitalism epoch, in which we've seen fundamental restructuring of the system. And we are in new terrain with regard to our struggles. So we've seen the rise of a globally integrated production, financial, and service system, the rise of a transnational capitalist class and truly transnational capital. So we're integrated in and facing capitalism in new ways. And that means new challenges for our transformative projects. So I'm going to make the assertion that national transformative projects are no longer viable in the age of globalized capitalism. We have the most recent case study of Greece, but I want to actually go back to 1983. Remember that in one of the most powerful countries in the world, in France, Mitterrand came to power, and within months, he couldn't implement his social democratic agenda because the global financial markets threw the whole country into chaos. And that was already nearly 40 years ago and in a very powerful capitalist country. This is not to argue, I want to make crystal clear, that struggles at the nation state level are no longer relevant. On the contrary, these struggles play out locally, regionally, nationally, but they must be conjoined with transnational and global studies and coordinate global struggles in new ways beyond the old internationalism. So for me, and I think for all of us here, it's not even controversial to say that we need to transnationalize social movements, workers' organizations and struggles, and left organizations. We know that. And I'm going to assert, I think many people would agree, that we do need global political umbrella forums and organizations. I know that there's now the Progressive International. I don't know much about it yet. I want to find out a lot more. There's in Europe, DIEM 25, and there's many other instances. Samir Amin put out this famous call right before he passed away a few years ago for a new Fifth International, and that generated, I think Robert also had a contributing chapter in the, all of the forums in response to that. But I don't think we can go back to an organization like the World Social Forum. And we do have signs beyond the Progressive International and DIEM 25. We have Industrial. Maybe Turkle knows much more about that. It's a global industrial union. In 2019, worldwide, Uber workers went on strike. There were some 25 to 26, 27 countries where Uber workers had a global day of strikes, ranging from Kenya and Nigeria to Brazil, the United States, and most European countries. In just this past year, in the midst of the pandemic, Amazon workers in 12, 13 different countries coordinated going out on strike. So these things are starting, but they're not yet effective, and they have to be deepened and extended. And they need their organizations, political organizations. So for me, the question is not do we need transnational and global social movements and left organizations and unions, but what are the challenges that we face in achieving them? And for me, to put this in a larger context, global capitalism is right now in deep, deep crisis. It's a structural crisis, an economic crisis, we know that, but it's also a political crisis of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. And that's putting aside the ecological, existential dimensions of the crisis. A 2020 global survey reported that 56% of people around the world believe that capitalism is doing more harm than good. And that is a crisis of hegemony of this global capitalist system. Yet we have no significant global left to take advantage of this crisis. And we have this paradox. We have a proliferation around the world of social movements burgeoning every corner of the world, of every type: workers' movements, peasants, women, students, environmentalists, anti-racists, indigenous, anti-austerity, anti-corruption, LGBTQ. All of this amassed global, since 2008, really, this global revolt is intensifying. from 2017 to 2019, we experienced a worldwide people's spring. Fall 2019 was the peak moment there. And this global revolt is acquiring a truly global character. In fact, from 2018 to 2020, there were 100 major anti-government uprisings around the world, which toppled 30 governments. And even then it picked up again, even in the midst of the pandemic, halfway through the pandemic. But here's the thing, we have this global people's spring and revolt underway, but a severe crisis of the organized left, of the party left, of the institutional left. And for the most part, then we're seeing the unfolding of this global revolt without any link up to political vehicles and umbrella organizations that can link them all together and give them a coherent, transformative political project. There are some exceptions. The most recent exception is India. The mass strikes in India had Marxist and revolutionary political parties and trade unions coming together, I mean, bringing it together, but sort of that gives us inspiration to say we need this in other countries and at a global level. So what we're seeing is there's no unifying program in and across borders. Some people say that's good, we shouldn't have them, but I'm arguing we absolutely need them. So we have no unifying transformative project that links together all of these diverse struggles, all of these different fronts of struggle and particular sectoral struggles with the common denominator, which is global capitalism and the need for a socialist and a transformative project. But and we don't have that because also we don't have the vehicles, political vehicles across borders and globally that can aggregate these diverse movements, translate mass aspirations to a larger transformative perspective. We have, to just go back to 2011, one example is Egypt. The most beautiful, inspiring uprising of people's power in Egypt overthrew the Mubarak dictatorship. But without a transformative political project and an organization to keep that going and push for fundamental transformations in Egypt, it simply went back to an even more brutal dictatorship. So I'm going to assert, and I know there would be disagreements, we need a new modern prince for the 21st century. And that modern prince needs to be transnational and global. And here we need to critique both horizontalism and verticalism. Vanguardism and verticalism is a bankrupt strategy from the 20th century, won't get us anywhere in the 21st century, but horizontalism, which says, let's just stay here below, we don't need political vehicles, we don't need to challenge, confront the state, is also bankrupt. Both of those are two extremes which are not going to get us very far. So we need to rethink in new ways a three-way relationship in our struggles that brings together social movements, trade unions and worker organizations, and left and socialist political parties in a context in which the mass social movements from below have total independence from the political parties, but coordinate struggles with a larger transformative project. The left needs to reinvent itself, not fall back on social democracy. So I'll conclude. I saw that I have 1 minute, probably now about 40 seconds. So let me just conclude that in these challenges, and of course this is all synthesized, right? It's synopsis in 8 minutes. But 4 quandaries we face in all of this. One I already mentioned, how do we move beyond national and regional borders, beyond the old internationalism? Secondly, how do we close the gap between mass social movements and popular uprisings, and the lack of any political vehicles or cross-border transformative projects that we're all uniting behind. Third, in the absence of a socialist left discourse and political presence, we're seeing narrow identity politics of diversity, inclusion, representation, even reactionary anti-Marxism is quite present, and that's a serious problem. And fourth and finally, and I'll end with this, when we don't have this transnational and global left strategy in front of us and in place, we're opening space for neo-fascism, which is the far right is gaining more ground worldwide in general than the left, and that's extremely dangerous. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much, Louis. And I already see connections between the two speakers, and perhaps people in our audience will see the connections too. And that it gives us a moment now to turn to Catherine. So please.
Great, thanks, Robert. And thank you, Mike and William. Those were excellent presentations. And thanks to Eve as well. It's been very nice corresponding with you. And I I share your, sentiment and feeling that we need to get this organizing going. And so I'm going to take things into more the micro level in terms of thinking about actually how we organize and putting that in context. I think often we get into these debates in the literature, but also, well, more so in the literature, around optimism, pessimism, local, global. There's a lot of these dichotomies and people get stuck in these debates, and we don't get on to actually thinking about, how do we actually build this work? What is useful organizing in terms of, mobilizing and encouraging people to become active around transnational issues? So I'm going to speak to that a little bit. So I'm going to give you a few quick notes from my research that I think might be useful for this discussion and moving it out of these dichotomies. So my book that I'm completing charts labor internationalism within Canadian unions. It's focused on the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, institutionally. And I did some interviews with CSN as well, but it's such a different history in terms of internationalism. So it's really more on the Anglo unions. So what did I find in this? Just to give us some context, institutionally, the CLC and its predecessor federations were loyal participants in the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions operations internationally. And so that was the anti-communist international. And while many of the unions in the CLC were branches of American-based unions at that time, they did develop their own particular brand of labor imperialism that was linked to their sense of strategic place within the British Empire. And so this was the case in their role in the Colombo Plan, in the English Caribbean, in Kenya, and also their settler identity, as in the case of Palestine and what they did in Palestine. In the 60s and 70s, this started to shift, and the CLC became closer to some of the social democratic trade unions in the ICFTU in terms of their approach to the international sphere. And then as the Canadian International Development Agency, was formed, they started to really do a lot of this kind of labor development work. But at this time, there was a huge movement of grassroots rank and file workers who became active on issues of international solidarity. And many of these groups and networks were a significant counterforce to this institutionalized internationalism of the CLC, challenging labor imperialism and so forth. They were active. They also ended up really transforming the institutional space within Canadian unions for doing this kind of work. And so because of that, the organizing around apartheid, around the coup in Chile, the Central American struggles, there was a lot of education, mobilization, activism that was also, created space for the mobilizations around free trade that were to come. And so in the 90s, there was a huge sense of hopefulness around, new transnational labor institutions and coordinations, mergers transnationally between unions, and this has not materialized. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I can go into that in Q&A. What has happened? There have been, many experiments with, economically focused strategic campaigns, experiments with institutional changes like merger agreements. So the steel workers were involved in something like that. And theirs, I think, have been the most interesting generally. And let's see. Sorry. But what's interesting about the strategic campaigns, I think they were seen as a progression from the political work, and they're not necessarily so. So the political work that was happening, the kind of political solidarities of the 70s and 80s and early 90s was really politically oriented, rank and file led and run, and sometimes supported by staff and leaders in terms of what you were saying, William, in terms of the institutional, the kind of vertical horizontal piece. That did play a role in their success, having some of those institutional supports. And while the economically focused strategic campaigns that started to develop were generally, staff and leadership run and led, and And I think that remains the case. I think today we still see that. The political side of international solidarity tends to still be more member run, whereas these kind of economic strategic campaigns are more staff and leadership driven. Okay, well, I raise these differences because I think it's important to think about the nature of the organizing on the ground. In light of the history of labor imperialism, in light of the rise of right-wing populism, I think the kind of political work and the way that organizers did political solidarity work in the 70s, 80s, and 90s has a lot to teach us about how we might want to build this work in terms of how they did education, on their emphasis on worker self-activity and mobilizations, direct actions. And so I think it's really important for us to develop a critical lens to transnationalism. Not all forms of transnationalism are good, as we see with, the Service Employees International Union raiding, teachers unions in Puerto Rico more recently, right? So labor imperialism is not over, and not all of these forms of transnational coordination between unions are actually empowering for workers. So it's important to see it within a critical lens to, how does this actually build worker power, workers' resistance, worker organizations, and I think that we have a lot to learn from the way that people organized in this period. And so I will leave it at that and say, I've got some articles out there you can look at if you're interested in those things. And we did organize a conference a couple of years ago on how we build. It was a trade union academic conference on building international solidarity, and I will post the YouTube link in the chat after. I just want to end by saying that today is the Global Day of solidarity with the Palestinian people, and today there was a call that came from Palestinian unions with 3 concrete actions that Palestinian unions would like to see happen internationally, and I'll post the call in French and English in the chat as well. But I'll just go over them. So first is, they're looking for public statements that express support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. 2, standing in solidarity with future general strikes. So on Tuesday, there were general strikes across historic Palestine. And so asking for holding protests or vigils on those days that will come in the future. And finally, taking steps to ensure our unions are not investing in apartheid through pension investments, et cetera. And so I'll post those there. And for those, and I'll post also the social media stuff for Labor for Palestine, which I've been active in. And for those who are interested in doing some work around that, please get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was perfect time-wise, and there's lots of great material in there for us to think about. So now, Torkel, please make sure you unmute. You're still muted there. Perfect. No, not yet.
Like this.
That's it.
Nope.
You're fine now. Yeah. No, you just muted yourself. You just went back. Yeah. No, it's still.
Is it okay now?
That's it. Stay
Okay.
there. Stay there. Stay there. That's good. Yeah.
What's happening?
You muted again.
Muted again. You're hitting something after you unmute yourself and start doing your presentation. I don't know.
Like this?
Yeah.
Yes. Don't touch
fine.
anything.
And don't touch anything.
No.
What happened? when we discuss the transformation from capitalism to socialism and strategies to obtain this as the establishment of a new international, there are some historical facts I think we should take into consideration. As capitalism became globalized through colonialism, it also had a polarizing effect caused by the imperialist transfer of value. The capitalist system became structured in this center periphery formation. And this division has deepened throughout the last century, expressed in the huge difference between living standard and wage level between the global north and the south. This wage difference has caused the outsourcing of most industrial productions to low-wage countries. Through global change of production, the value of trillions of millions is transferred in form of profits to capital and also cheap products to the consumers in the global north. Secondly, I think that all through the economy of capitalism is globalized. The political framework of the world system is still organized around the nation state. The construction of transnational institutions during neoliberalism was done by nation state, and they have also the power to deconstruct them. In the recent decades, we have seen a demand for stronger nation states again in America first and Brexit and so on. And after 40 years of neoliberal pressure for transnational governance, I think that imperialist rivalry is back now. As for the working class, despite of the calls for proletarian of all nations to unite in the Communist Manifesto, I think that nationalism still has a strong grip in the socialist movement. We all know the appeal of the Second International to the working class just before the World War to turn against the class enemy instead of each other was in vain. The Second International was split between the Social Democrats, which actually emphasized the national state and citizenship as a framework for developing socialism, while the communist fraction insisted on the world revolution as the condition for the development of socialism. The Soviet Union was also the driving force behind the formation of the Communist International in 1919, and Lenin was convinced that the survival of the Russian Revolution depended on the continuation of the world revolution, or at least a revolution in the developed capitalist countries. Later in the 30s, the Soviet Union adopted the maxim of socialism in one country. However, I think that Comintern was not completely in vain. Its effort was crucial for the development of the Chinese, Vietnamese, and other revolutionary movements in the global south. But I think since then we have missed this international coordination of the struggle. And I think that there are two important examples. One was that in the 60s and the 70s, there was a huge global wave of revolutionary movements which actually challenged imperialism. There were, I think, more than 40 revolutionaries attempts, and at that time, millions were willing to fight and die for socialism. US was defeated in Vietnam, and liberation struggles was victorious in Latin America and in Africa, and they established states intending to develop socialism. But due to lack of cooperation between the liberation movements and between the newly liberated state, in combination with the split between China and the Soviet Union, imperialism was able to launch a military and political and economic counteroffensive in form of neoliberalism, which terminated this revolutionary wave of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. A more recent attempt was this social forum, which actually there was much hope in the beginning. But I agree with the former speeches that, and to quote Elvis, a little less conversation and a little more action was actually needed. I think today the objective conditions for radical change are very good. Capitalism is in this structural crisis, both economically, but also the capitalist class, I think, is politically divided between one part which wants to continue and the neoliberalism, and another part which have gone back to national conservatism, or even a kind of the fascism. So they are also politically divided. And then, of course, the system is on a collision course with climate and nature in general. And also the system is running out of periphery to exploit, I think. It's the subjective forces of revolution which is the problem. The response to the crisis of global capitalism has been, as mentioned, a lot of spontaneous revolution and rebellions around the world in the last couple of years. They differ in background and demands, but they have this in common, that they don't have a very clear vision of an alternative, and they don't have a strategy to reach it. They lack the kind of organizations which can take the struggles from demonstrations in the street to more differentiated and coordinated forms of struggle and alliances which can lead to actually change. The organization structures and the experience with the socialist states have been discredited. And I think at the moment now there is actually a fear of taking power and a disbelief in a workable socialist alternative. We have to learn from the failures from the past. However, there is a trend to focus on the failures rather than the achievements, and this has resulted in a kind of ideological dissolution and pessimism. The experience of former international and the ongoing struggle, I think, is that nationalism has been a kind of Trojan horse which has divided the proletariat. To avoid this, I think that the struggle on the national level must be based on a clear global perspective. Production is organized now globally. Commodities are traded in a highly integrated world market. The global economic and political contradictions determinates to a large extent the outcome of national and local struggles. And on their side, these struggles must contribute to move the global contradictions in the right direction. The global perspective also entails a strong anti-imperialist aspect. The defense of our our imperial mode of consumption and the capitalist welfare state is not a step towards socialism. I think that our struggle must be coordinated and supported, and support the primary driver for change, I think, which is the struggle in the global south. However, how should this international struggle be established? Comintern was established by rather uniform communist party, and with the backing of the first socialist states and with the esteem of Lenin. The situation today is very different. Socialist and communist movement are fragmented and divided into a multitude of political lines and issues. And I don't think that a new international can be constructed for some kind of master plan from above. It has to be built from below. We need to have a global perspective up front in all our local and national strategies, and in the development of each of our organization, and build this network of action. In that way, I think we can build many different internationals: trade union, peasant movement, indigenous people, based on race and gender struggles, and anti-imperialism and climate struggles. And these sub-internationals could be coordinated into some kind of more holistic international, and again focusing on action and not just talk. I think that in our daily life we we often feel that we are doing too little and it's too unimportant what we do in terms of changing the world. However, I think there is no small struggles and no small resistance. There are separate sets of actions and interventions which can be converged into one big force of change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is great, and there's already a question, and people should be thinking of any questions. And I will read it, and it's relevant to what had come up at some point. Anyway, which is the Progressive International. So this is Valérie Leroux, and she says, I'm reading her comment. Thanks to all panelists already. This is really thought-provoking discussion. I'd like to hear you all a bit more about Progressive International, which seems very promising to me. As said briefly, it's an initiative launched a year ago with the aim to organize, unite, and mobilize progressive forces around the world. Membership is pretty global, but the leadership still seems mostly Western, founded by the Sanders Foundation and the M25 initiative, the European ones we know, despite its decolonial vision. I would like to hear your thoughts about the challenges to put that vision into the organizational practices of those different types of initiatives. So does anybody want to start? That if anybody's, maybe somebody that's particularly familiar with the Progressive International has followed it. I mean, I know William said you were starting to look into it, but that might be a good way to start. Like, there is something on the table, so to speak. It's not the only thing out there, that's for sure. But depending, but it's one of them. It's the most prominent one, right? So I would say it's not, so anybody want to start with that? Micah, did you say you had something, or was it Catherine on the internet? Like what?
I mean, I don't know much about Progressive Internationals. If you want to go a little bit in depth into what it is, and
okay, yeah. I mean, so no one knows much about it. I don't know if you talk. Oh, you do, William? Okay, because I thought you said you were just getting into it, but that'd be great. Just to kind of lay out what you think may be at stake, relating it to some of the comments that have been made already. That's already been, Valerie has already done that to some degree, raising the colonial issues and such, right? But please, William.
Well, I'll make it brief, but I think the Progressive International, I tremendous respect for the people that brought it together. But I think it's gone already, at least in what it's proposing, way beyond the World Social Forum. So it pushes forward what we need to be doing. The World Social Forum said that you couldn't have political parties as part of the forum, number one, only social movement. Secondly, no violence. Well, that's a strategic and a tactical question. And so the Zapatistas could not, for instance, could not be part of the World Social Forum. And third, the World Social Forum always resisted any minimum program across borders that everyone could agree to. There was even a proposal at one time, it came from Walden Bellio and Manuel Wallerstein and other people from Brazil for a 10-point common program of very basic stuff, a debt moratorium and global minimum wage, and even that was resisted. So my understanding of the Progressive International is that they weren't bringing together social movements with parties and insisting on a common minimum program across borders. And I also saw a draft for that program. I don't know much about it, but this much that I'm saying I do know. And so I think in that, at least a little bit I do know, this is a major step forward. And I personally want to find out more and maybe become more involved with the Progressive International. That's what I can say.
Well, if I can jump in on the decolonizing aspect. So it is a very important question, but it is really, it's not only hard to do, it's a process that's never going to end, because I work on the decolonization of the mind using African philosophers and people like that. So I'm not talking about decolonizing movements with indigenous people in Canada or decolonizing movements with Palestine and stuff like that. I'm thinking about how we can organize in a less colonial way. And that starts with how our subjectivity functions and how we subjectively view other people. And in solidarity in general, it's that we end up having leaders who are white and Western, such as in the environmental movements, who has been who has been called or considered as the leader, the young female leader. It's Greta Thunberg. But other young female leaders like Autumn Pelletier, or not that young, but Maxima in Peru, have been fighting for climate as indigenous women. There's Nakate, the story of when there was this picture of Greta Thunberg and two other young activists, and then Vanessa Nakate, who's, if I'm not mistaken, from Uganda, and the Associated Press cut Nakate from the picture because it made it look more like the image we have of young female activists in environmental movements. That's colonial. That's how we racialized leadership. And so I think, that being said, I think it's not a matter of just, I mean, it's okay to start movements, and our circles are usually Western because we are in Western countries. But that being said, when you expand the membership, or when you think about an initiative, it's not only to have, obviously, it's not only to have some more people at the table, it's to reorganize how the chairs are organized around the table, and who sets the agenda and who takes the notes. And so decolonizing is really on the day-to-day practices, and it's a very complicated and painful process. And if you don't ask yourselves these questions every day, or if it's not painful, then you're not doing it well. I mean, I'm also really enthusiastic about the initiative itself. But you're really asking an interesting question, which is, for whom is the transition, the post-capitalist transition? And I think if we're not hearing the voices, and the voices are there, we're just not listening well enough. So, but yeah, we could have a beer about that if you add a physical conference.
Right. That's great. I mean, there's a couple other questions I want to get to them. Though we should, just as a footnote to what's been said, it's a few of the presentations, there have been, people have noted in the last 20, 30 years, a lot more sort of sensitivity coloniality that was going on during the Comintern. Some of you are familiar with that, but sometimes, right, that's a number of historians have noted it, and so on, even among colonial and a lot of racialized people. And so there's a lot more was going on than the normal, typical big story of the narrative of the Comintern, right? That was taking place in transnationally, right? And there's books like that. I just reviewed one, transnational, something, I forgot the name of it. It's coming out in Science and Society in a few months. But again, there's lots of that work. So if anybody's interested, they can write to me, and I could give them some references. But I do want to address some of the other questions to get mindful of time. There's one that is put, which will just make sure we got it right on time. Does any panelists believe in the universality of protracted people's war as a method to transnational social, cultural, and economic change? I know William had a comment that did speak to that to some degree, but others may also have some thoughts on that. Anybody want to take that up? Oh, okay, Turkey, go ahead, please, and make sure that the mute. Keep it off all the time now, because while we're going to go back and forth with answers. Yeah, that's okay. It. Don't touch.
Well, that's also relates to what William mentioned, that one of the problems with this international is who is in and who is out, and this is also the question, as William mentioned, is armed struggle in or out, and I think that we have that the people's war is also a kind of, it is waged in part of India, and has been part of the struggle in Nepal, and it still is. So I don't think that we can rule it out. There are many different kinds of the struggle, and the armed struggle is a problem for many of these kinds of constructions of the international, also on the practical level, because many of them are are deemed like terrorists and are hunted by police forces and intelligence service. So it would be difficult even to have meetings with the representatives of them. So it is a real problem for a greater holistic international. And I think there's also one big problem. I think we have to address how do we incorporate China in this international. China is the country with the biggest population, and its economy is becoming the world's most important. And what is going on in China and struggles in China are extremely important for the transfer from capitalism to socialism. And it is, I think it's very difficult to include China in all these kinds of progressive international or World Socialist Forum or things like that. We haven't managed to include the struggles in China in this. And also we have to, China is complicated in many ways, because China is also now, I think, the only force we can balance and counterbalance the hegemony of the US. So there's a lot of the issues which we have to discuss, I think, about the role of China and the class struggle in China, and how to balance different kinds of issues.
Anybody else want to come? Okay. Well, then I'd like to address another question in there in the end, and this is from Errol Sharp 2. I don't know if it's different from the Errol Sharp 1, who I know, but anyway, unfortunately we can't know. But Errol's saying, we say our goal is socialism. We talk about socialism as if there is some common understanding of what socialism is. What would socialism look like on the ground? As panelists have stated, governments have been overthrown, but then what? What do we want to build? And I'm sure that's the Errol Sharp 1, based on that question. So that small question, right? Anyway, so how about somebody addressing that? Catherine, do you have any thoughts on that? No?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because just teaching a course this year where students really wanted to look into this for the 4th year, and there was a book called Economy for the 99%. I don't know if people have checked it out, anyways. But like it's interesting. I was teaching the future of work this year, and so many students were just so interested in all these questions around post-capitalism, you know, because it's just the logical consequence of thinking about all these questions, you know, technology, environment, so forth. And so yeah, we've been having some interesting conversations. I think, I mean, just the fact that these conversations are happening more and more is exciting. I don't know what space you know, we would come to actually, you know, think through any of these concrete features of this, but I think it is hopeful that we are seeing a lot more people taking this up and you know, moving into, you know, questions of, you know, workers' control and what that would look like in very concrete terms is always makes me hopeful. So I'll just leave it at that.
Anybody else want to? Yeah, William, please.
Well, I don't think we can say beforehand this is exactly a global socialist project that you know, that we want. But I think also we want to remember, you know, we as academics think about these historical and theoretical and big question issues, but the mass of people that would actually make socialism or even force capitalism to reform in a more positive direction are people that fight for their immediate survival needs. How do I pay my rent this month? How can I increase the minimum wage here in the United States to 15 hours? How can I get the medical, you know, care that I need? How can, you know, what about, etc. And so, you know, in that regard, I don't think we can preconceive a socialist project as much as join these struggles and push them as much towards a more transformative direction. So I agree with Catherine about the issue of workers' controlled essential, pushing for redistribution, re-regulation, nationalizing finance, but because those are concrete things. But also, I very much support the global Green New Deal. We know that that's not socialism. It's, we can call it social democracy. You could call it the state intervening for public employment and some re-regulation and environmentalism. But that's how, we get started. And that, once that gets off the ground and it's linked to these daily survival struggles of billions of people, then we can start thinking about, what socialism might look like in a transition to it.
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you. So there's another question, which is presented in French, and
want me to translate it?
Yeah, I can understand it, but you'll do better than me. Mine's a little rusty, so I have to go back and be immersed again to get it back in my head. Yeah.
It's from Marie-Josée Parent, and she says, thanks for everyone for your presentations. She says, I would like to have your thoughts on ways to finance an international organization, how we could or should finance except from membership. So what action should be put forward to materially transform our economical system, but I think it's mainly about how to finance the transition post-capitalist.
Right, and that's from Marie-Josée Parent, just because she did put her name, yeah. I'm assuming, yeah. But please, that doesn't mean, this is brass tacks organizational question, which is really very important, right? I mean, what does it mean that the Sanders Foundation is funding, for example, the Progressive International and the 25, the EM Europe 25 group? I mean, right? I mean, so any thoughts on how to start to get something going off the ground, so to speak, right? Because it's there's always that problem with any organizational building, like when you get that scale up issue, right? What does it take unless you do get that massive grant, like oh my God, I got $5 million from so-and-so, whatever. And we can now do some things. But short of that, if something is really, there's all kind of models that we have, right? I mean, the party dues systems, the union dues system, there, right? Some of the internationals in the past had these issues. I mean, Marx struggled with this in the first international a lot. In terms that there was a lot of debt built up because people didn't pony up, including organizations. So yeah, I mean, right? I mean, this also, I think maybe go ahead, please.
Everyone just needs to find their angles, and then we're good.
Yeah, right.
Just a bunch of rich people giving all their money away.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. But that's one question also, is how it just relates that people do need to think in organizational terms about these things. I don't mean just the financing, because I think the question speaks to that broader question that and I would just say in it, I mean, in the spirit of the question is something I'm very obsessed with, is not just how to get it started, but how to keep it going, because the history doesn't speak well, right, to that keeping it going, unfortunately, right? So that's a whole nother story, but anyway, but thank you so I just want to go to the next question, and it's anonymous, which is great. And thanks to all the panelists. It's been a great discussion so far. I'm curious as to what the panelists think can form the basis of international solidarity in the face of globalized division of labor. In much of the westernized world, laborers' work and services and working conditions exist in stark difference to the proletarians in the global south, who work for less than subsistence wages. Can we expect to see a truly global movement arising out of the Western world, or would this inevitably originate from the struggles of the people of the global south? Which some of you know, of course, like, what was it, 10 years ago, especially, the faith in social, possibly of anti-capitalism, was resuscitated because of, right, the faith in the global south, right? So this is and have we actually come to terms with that? I think part of what this question speaks to, have we actually come to terms with that? Because that became, oh my God, I remember Toronto HM, right? quite a long time ago, that everything was about that issue, right? It's all happening in the global South. It's all going to be, and okay, it all didn't necessarily happen in the global South. So where are we after that, in a sense, right? Where are we now? It's not about taking colonialism and not colonialism and neo-coloniality seriously. It's about, again, an organizational building, to make that happen, which speaks to many things that people have offered in terms of who's at the table and not, and where does the momentum come from to create a truly international one. So, I see, Kate, please. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of political struggles happening right now, like this week. Like, think about Colombia, think about Algeria, think about Palestine, think about, there's so many, 80, like there's so many, we just have to, I don't think we have to wait about stuff happening only in the global South. I think there's a lot of solidarities already existing that we need to build on, and not think that if we organize and I've seen that a lot in Montreal, like if you organize a march in support to Palestine, maybe look at groups who are already doing it, groups who have built relationships with activists from Palestine for years. Or I think it's sometimes we stop looking, so we stop seeing what's happening, but it's really happening. And I think, yes, I think it will happen for sure through solidarities between movements. And I agree with the question, which is the comment, which is it won't happen only in the Western world, and we shouldn't wait for the messiah of movements which would originate in the global north. We need to build on what's already happening and go forward with that. And so, and also, Robert, just by the way, there's 2 questions in the answered part that were not answered before, because Eliane put it in the chat, and anyways.
Oh, but I would also say I'm mindful of the time, unfortunately, but this question also relates to something which I know Yves was concerned about, right? Yves Rochon, which is class composition also, right? Recomposition. And some of the things that have been said by you all very relevant to that, because that's also part of that question, right? I mean, obviously we can't all answer these things, but William, did you want to speak to that directly? I see your hand, please.
I want to say that I do agree that the division between the global north and the global south is still a burning, both a structural and a burning political issue. So I want to make clear that I'm not arguing against that, but I started my own presentation by saying that I think global capitalism is a qualitatively new epoch in the ongoing and open-ended evolution of world capitalism over more than 500 years. And that is changing North-South relations. And there's several things going on. The labor aristocracy, the privileged position that workers in the global North had, only goes back about 120, 130 years to the second half of the 1800s. And with the onslaught of capitalist globalization, there's a gradual erosion of that higher status and privileged position of workers in the global North. There's downward mobility, socioeconomic destabilization, precaritization, so forth, and so on. That's part of the reason that neo-fascism and far-right populism is so appealing in the global North, because it's saying to those groups, we'll restore your high status that you enjoyed for over 100 years, right? But so that opens up new opportunities for North-South solidarity, and it starts changing the whole ball game here. And there's a third worldization of workers in the first world. Now that's drawn out process over years. I'm not talking about today. Everyone's the same around the world. And there's also in the global South, we need to see that it's not a whole colonized population against the global North. There's a new transnational capitalist class in the global South, and there's new middle layers that have high standards of living and enjoy the fruits of global integration and everything that we could have in the global North. So things are changing. And in this sense, they are changing in a way that creates a much more organic basis for transnational North-South solidarity beyond the earlier internationalism. Yeah, we're privileged here, but we support your national liberation struggle. And again, just to conclude, that's not to say that North-South division isn't still a burning matter, but we have to see how this is transforming.
Thank you, William, and Mike as well. I mean, it's a difficult question. All these questions we could spend all afternoon on, as Michael, I think it said. So there is one more question. I'll make sure we get it in, and it's for Torkel. I don't know if you're able to see it, Torkel, but it's anonymous person, and what are the concrete possibilities for solidarity with the global South from the first world? So it's partly addressing that, but like I said, this is a topic that we could do just a 3-day conference just on that topic and still not get anywhere we'd like to go. So do you think we should focus on the third world populations within our own countries, and material support money? What else can we do, given we have the internet as a tool for just at our disposal? So are you?
Can you move me? Yes.
Yes, you're good.
Yeah, I think that I think that it is a very interesting question, because I think that this imperialism question still matters a lot, and I think the majority of the population in the global north are still defending their imperial way of mode of living, and they will continue to do that for some time. The majority. But there are always streams and counter streams in the global north, and there have always been this counter streams. And I think also before the resistance in the global north was important. The resistance against the Vietnam War was a very big contribution to the struggle in the north. And material support is important, and also I think that it's important to fight racism and fascism in the global north, because it will turn against the global south in forms of discrimination and in forms of closed borders and so on. We can see that this huge difference in living standards still plays a big role because of the immigration. The pressure on the American border, the pressure on European borders show that the third world and our part of the world is not becoming more or less the same thing. There are, of course, billionaires also in the third world, and there are minorities of people living on like in the third world, also in our part of the world, but they are. It's not mainstream. I think the mainstream political movement is this right-wing populism, which is geared towards a defense of the imperial mode of living, and we have to change our way of living into a more solidarity way of living, not living on the back of others. We are using commodities and throw them away, and we are flying in airplanes in a way that the rest of the world cannot do. Also in ecological terms, there's a huge difference of our lifestyle, and we are not becoming more or less the same. So these things matters a lot.
Thank you very much, Turkil. So I recognize our time is up. If anybody has any final comment, I do want to say, if anybody's thinking of a final thing to say, that I did put in the chat a email, globaltry30@gmail.com, like global word try, TRI 30. The numbers random. This is an email that Yves Rochon set up, and we were just talking about possibly seeing, if people are interested in trying to develop some kind of exchange research network on this topic to continue. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I think she obviously, or he, or they are interested. But the question, if people are interested, just write that, and maybe we can figure out ways of going forward. Could continue, because you can see from this conversation that there's just so much to do and to organize and think about. And all of us on the panel here and in the audience can mobilize knowledge, and to use a word that you hear all the time out there, you know, in the neoliberal world, but you know, we know what it means, and we know how important that is, and the theory and ideas. We have a long way to go in thinking about it, and calls are great, but the hard work of building it and thinking through all that is quite daunting and challenging. So we need as many people. And at some point, right, that starts creating the conditions. All those previous international efforts came from people thinking through possibilities and ideas, whether we agreed with them or not, and so on. But the big efforts that became important historically, that's how they started, right? It just wasn't, they just weren't, you know, hatched automatically somewhere, or just the will of one person. So anyway, so if people notice, if you should write that email, or you can find our contact, or, you know, you can look us up or something, but, or if you want to look me up, you know, so at York University. So anyway, I know our time is up and people want to get to the panels and such. So I hope everybody, I know we can't do any sound and all that, but want to offer a really hearty and you know, heartfelt, profound thanks for a really good discussion from everybody. And again, to recognize Yves Rochon, who has done the work and really to put this all together, to make it happen, to the starting a year ago. William has said, you know, a year ago even. So I know, and he's a very good activist and so on. I do see a couple of things more here about technology. I don't know if we can go on for 5 more minutes, or people can. I mean, I don't know if Eliane or facilitator has any views there, but there are a couple more questions. But yeah, we have one that's the encouragement to read that from Alex about reading Williams' Global Capitalism, and then anonymous person, as development of technology made what used to be considered unproductive now productive, but so on. So if this is the case, then the first world performs that way. So anyway, I guess we're being put off there. I see everything disappearing, but technology question, again, so many things that, you know, again, because capitalism transforming, William emphasized, and which many of us have certainly become very, very sensitive to. So there's that going on, and the dialectic, the other side, what we can do or not do in relationship to that. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Next year, the following in Montreal.
Yeah, I hope so. Looking forward to it.